What's up guys, it's Kristen here today with my July wrap-up. Now, I didn't read a ton of books in the month of July, but I feel like I have a lot to say about each of them, so let's just jump right into this so that it's not a 20-minute video with the first book that I finished this month. Finally, dun dun dun, I finished Jonathan Strange and Mr.Norrell, officially now the longest book I have ever read at just over 1,000 pages, though I'm making it sound like it was this huge feat. Honestly, I really enjoyed it. I didn't find it a difficult read. I'm still hoping to do a full review of this and also talk about my thoughts on the BBC TV show adaptation. I just haven't had time to film it yet, so I won't go into too much detail here. One more time, I will briefly describe the synopsis. The book is set in the early 1800s in an alternate history world where magic has always existed and everybody knew about it, but for some reason 200 years before the beginning of the book, magic just disappeared from England and nobody can figure out why, and now there are only people who call themselves theoretical magicians who just study magic and the history of it, until of course Jonathan Strange and Mr.Norrell come along and they are the first practical magicians, and all of the events are set off when Mr.Norrell makes a deal with a certain mythical creature that, if you've read any fairy tale or fantasy books, you know is never to be trusted. That sets off a chain of events that leads to a lot of terrible outcomes, but it's also about the rivalry that slowly builds up between the two magicians, and it's mostly about their disagreements on who should practice magic. And I know I sound like I'm describing Harry Potter and the Slytherins, but in this case Norrell would be the Salazar Slytherin. He believes magic should be confined mainly to himself and Jonathan Strange, and Jonathan on the opposite end thinks that it should be taught to everybody, and the tension obviously slowly builds between them until there is a breaking point. And overall I really enjoyed this. Again, completely unique to anything I've ever read before, and it's almost written in the style of a book at the turn of the 19th century. I don't say that to scare anyone off though. Again, I thought it wasn't a difficult read whatsoever. There was a lot of humor in it, which I didn't really expect, a lot of lightheartedness. The only thing that kept me from completely falling in love with it was that I always felt a certain distance from the characters, that I couldn't completely connect with them. But I think that might just have been my experience because my sister was reading this at the exact same time as me, and she was practically crying over certain scenes because she felt that much for the characters. So maybe that's just a personal thing for me. Then next up, I attempted to read The Time of the Twins. I mentioned in my TBR that I wasn't exactly excited for it and I was very hesitant. You know, the cover isn't exactly helping things, but when I first started it, I really was into it, and it's a high fantasy novel and all of the kind of stereotypes that go along with that, and I was totally game for it. But then it just became too exposition heavy. I didn't really care about the characters, and I know in the beginning of fantasy series they really have to do that so that they can build up the world, but I just wasn't interested in it, and it's gotten to the point there's just so many great books and too little time, so ended up DNFing it, and I don't really feel bad about that anymore the way that I used to. The next book I read was The Crow Girl by Erik Axel Sund. I swear this is the heaviest book I have ever held in my life, and I do have a full review of this, so again, I won't go into too much detail, but this is a Swedish novel. It's just recently been released in English, and it was translated by Neil Smith, and I was sent this for a review by Knopf Publishing. The book opens when the body of a young immigrant boy is found, and it has been incredibly mutilated, and the main character, Jeanette Kilberg, is set on the case, and it's clear from the beginning that she's not going to get the necessary time and resources devoted to this case because he's not of Swedish origin. Then you also get the point of view from the murderer, and this book is definitely a psychological thriller more than anything else, and dealing with a certain mental illness, which I will not say here because it will be a spoiler, which is also kind of my problem with the book. In its attempt to sensationalize a mental illness, there's also an incredible amount of graphic, disturbing violence and subject matter, and I didn't think for the most part that it was handled well, and overall I just didn't think the writing was great and the plot was all over the place. But a very interesting fact that I learned because somebody thankfully commented it on my review video was that this was originally a trilogy when it was released in Swedish, which I knew. What I didn't know though was that the original trilogy, if you total all 3 books pages together, equal about 1,200 pages, and this is 767, so they have cut out more than 400 pages in order to condense it down and release it in English, and it shows. There are so many plot holes, there are so many underdeveloped characters, so many parts that feel like they have been cut out, and then suddenly it all made sense to me when I read that comment and found that out, and I am just baffled why they would not just release it as a trilogy. I feel like it's difficult already to make it through a nearly 800-page book. I would much rather read 3 separate ones, so I think the publishers just made a huge mistake on that point. Of course, that wouldn't have eliminated all the other problems that I have with the book, but I feel like it would have at least helped in some respects. Next up, I read The Lie Tree by Frances Hardinge. I was told this was a middle grade novel because the heroine is 14 years old, but honestly, I feel like the writing was very sophisticated in this, and it could be more of a YA or literary fiction novel. This is the story, as I said, of a 14-year-old girl. Her name is Faith, and she has just arrived on this island with her family because her father is trying to escape some kind of scandal that happened. You're not really sure what in their hometown, but of course rumors travel faster than anything, and eventually they do reach it to the island. Soon after, her father is seemingly murdered, though it could have possibly been a suicide, which is what everybody thinks. So Faith takes it upon herself to try to solve her father's murder, and in this discover what he was researching that led to the scandal. The book is set in the Victorian era and is very much about the constraints that were put on women at the time. Faith wants to be a scientist and really go against all the conventions for women at the time. And overall, I did really enjoy this book because I thought the writing was absolutely gorgeous. It had great atmosphere of a gothic Victorian novel, very dark story, which I didn't really expect. But the fantastical elements that came into play I could just never buy into, and they kind of ruined the story for me. And then I felt like the ending was a little too neat and tied up with a bow. I still enjoyed reading it and I would recommend it. It just fell a little flat for me in some of the areas. And last but not least, I finally finished The Crimson Petal in the White by Michel Faber. Hilary from Yrrobotfriend and I have been buddy reading this for the past 2 months, as it is quite the chunker. And this is the story of a prostitute named Sugar who slowly makes her way up in the ranks of society in Victorian England. I don't know what it is with the 19th century this month, but I seem to be living there with my books. But this was definitely my favorite read of the month. I thought it was absolutely excellent. So like I said in my TBR video for this a couple months back, I knew about this book because on Gilmore Girls, the grandmother Emily said she was reading it for her book club. And there are a lot of graphic sexual scenes in this book, naturally, with one of the main characters is a prostitute, but it's also a hyper-realistic, gritty portrayal. Every time there was one of those scenes, I could just picture Emily Gilmore in my mind, clutching her pearls, reading this in horror. It was just not what I was expecting whatsoever. I never really read a book like this where the entire time I had no clue where the story was supposed to be going. I didn't know where things were supposed to end up. I had some vague ideas in my head that I thought might be good if this happened to the characters, but the actual ending just blew me away. I could never have expected it or planned it out, but it was perfect. That being said though, this is definitely a book that is all about the beautiful writing and the characters and the world. It is not plot heavy whatsoever. Not a lot actually happens in the book, which is my only critique though, is that at some points it did feel too slow, and that's what kept me from completely loving it and giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. But I just loved living in this world and getting to know these characters, and you were finding out new things about them even 700 or so pages into the book. Hilary pointed out to me right at the beginning, because she's just brilliant, that this seemed like a flip or a satire of Jane Eyre, and at first I wasn't sure. I just saw little similarities, but then as the book went along, I couldn't help but notice them everywhere, except for the fact it's flipped because Jane Eyre in this book would be the character of Sugar, the prostitute, man that she is having an affair with. The would-be Rochester is just a terrible human being, and the thing that I love most about that is the fact that my biggest problem with Jane Eyre, which I'm not a huge Jane Eyre fan, I'm sorry to everybody out there, but I've always had such a problem with the portrayal of Rochester's first wife, Bertha. So in this book, the character who is the wife, who does have a mental illness, but at the beginning of the book, she seems incredibly simple. I just had no interest in finding out about her, but as the novel went on and you got more and more of her backstory, she became my favorite character of the novel. Like I said, the world in this book is just absolutely amazing. You feel like you are there in Victorian London, all the way from the city's underbelly, where all of the prostitutes and the drunks hang out, all the way to the upper echelons of society. I don't know if this is a book that I would recommend to everybody. As I said, it's a very different reading experience and not a ton actually happens in the book. But if you are a fan of just beautiful writing and great character study, then definitely I think you should give Crimson Petal and the White a try. So that is it for all of the books that I read in the month of July. Again, not my best reading month ever, though I never seem to do that great in the summertime for some reason. I don't know if that's just me. You have more time on your hands, but I seem to get less reading done, but that's okay. I don't feel bad about it or anything, but I would love to hear from you guys in the comments down below if you have read any of these books. Please leave your thoughts, and I will see you again soon. Bye!